Last April, my wife and I went to Branson, Missouri to catch Sight and Sound Theater's Jesus production. Let me tell you, that was phenomenal. You sit in this room of 2,000 people. They do 8 or 9 shows a week. That is all done live theater. And when we were there watching it, what was amazing is the close of the first act was unbelievable, because that scene where Jesus is walking on the water, they got this giant multi kind of it's a I don't know, highly tech screen. It's probably bigger, double, triple this whole wall, and they show scenes on it, and the waves are roaring, and the scenes and the boats are moving, and you're actually in a live theater going, how are they doing this? How are they pulling this thing off? It's amazing. And we're about 30 rows back, and they've got these huge wind machines blowing, and you feel the wind and even the spray of the ocean if you're in the audience. And then, of course, live pigs and sheep and stuff like that. Our daughter actually runs the costume shop at Sight and Sound Theater. So we went out there to see that. But the end of that first act, when Jesus walks on water and he pulls Peter up from out of the water, it was breathtaking, and it's just a stage play. I wonder what the real thing was like. I wonder what the real thing was like for the apostles sitting in the boat watching this event happen in real time with Jesus and no special effects, right? It's a famous story. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, the story Jesus walking on the water. In fact, it's such a famous story that's actually passed into an expression in our society. We'll say, oh, that guy thinks he's so cool, he thinks he walks on water. Right? What do you think? You think I can walk on water means like I'm righteous and I'm holy? Because it comes from this one miracle that Jesus did, and we find it in Matthew chapter 14, where Jesus walked on the water. And if you got a Bible, turn to Matthew 14, open your own. We provide them on the tables in front of you or on the ends. Over there's a table with a bunch of them. Grab a couple Bibles, share them. And we'll open up to Matthew chapter 14. If you're going to use the Bibles that we're providing, it's on page 989. And before I go any further, I'm just going to pray. Lord, I just pray that you would open up your word to our hearts and our minds today, that we could sense you, that we could feel you, that we would know through our hearts and our minds what you're saying to us individually, Lord. We ask this in your name. Amen. All right, so I'll read the story first. In Matthew chapter 14, it begins in verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, "Surely you are the Son of God." Now, if you've heard this story before in your Christian life, if you ever grew up in Sunday school or anything, the story usually goes, the moral to the story kind of goes like this, and this is the most common sermon that's preached. When you experience the troubles in life, faith can rise above the troubles of the storms of your life and make you walk above the troubles on the water if you keep your eyes on Jesus. But if you take your eyes off of Jesus and look at the size of your troubles and your problems, you will sink. But even in sinking, the Lord can save you if you cry out to his voice, and he can save you. And sometimes a pastor will go a little bit bigger and explain why Peter was the only one with the faith to even get out of the boat, which made him more extraordinary, and the guys who stayed in the boat were lesser so. And typically, walking above the water, overcoming your problems, and it's sort of you keep your eyes on Jesus. And oftentimes, they'll give you 3 ways to keep your eyes on Jesus. And You can guarantee that it's going to be Bible study, prayer, and worship will be one of the three. That's how they'll go. And there might be a couple more. Maybe they'll throw in a couple extras. And then usually something like 4 ways you keep your eyes on the storms of life and you see the problems instead of seeing Jesus. And wrap it up with a bow, say amen, and go home. And that was the sermon I was going to give you. But the more I studied this passage, the more troublesome that sermon got for me. It's true. Everything I just said is actually true. You could take from this passage all of those points. That it's absolutely true. Keep your eyes on Jesus in the trouble. Faith is like walking on water. If faith is being used, it's supernatural. It rises above your problems. If you take your eyes off Jesus and instead look at the size of your problems, you will sink in or you will fail. And I could give that sermon, and I could do it with a straight face, and it's actually a pretty decent sermon. The problem is, I think there's more going on in the story besides just that. I think when I read this story, I start to look at it and I go, here's the central problem for me. Jesus did not walk on the water just to make Peter the center of this story, right? The whole center of that story is it's all about Peter. It's about Peter getting out of the boat, Peter walking on the water, Peter keeping his eyes on Jesus, Peter sinking, Peter crying out, Lord, save me, Peter being saved, and Peter's the center of that story. The thing is, this story occurs 2 other times in the Bible. It actually occurs in Mark, and it occurs in John. Let's read the story in Mark chapter 6. We're in Matthew, just the next book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So we're going to go to Matthew, Mark chapter 6. And the interesting thing about the Mark story is we know from the early church fathers that when Mark wrote his gospel, he was actually writing Peter's words. Peter did the talking, and Mark did the dictating. Mark just wrote it down. And so what's interesting is the Gospel of Mark is actually Peter's story. We know that from the early church fathers. They tell us that. So here is the version in Mark, chapter 6, verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountains to pray. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And when he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against him, now about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked to them, and he said to them, Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. And then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure. And they marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. All right, this is the second version of the story. What's missing? Nothing about Peter, and it's his version. And he doesn't say anything about himself. Let's go to the Gospel of Luke. Oh, let's skip Luke, because Luke doesn't even bother to tell this story. He skips it entirely. So we're going to have to go to John. Let's look at the same story being told in John chapter 6. And in John chapter 6, he gives us this same story in verse 15, starting in verse 15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over to the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. And then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, It is I, do not be afraid. And then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Again, what's missing in John's story? None about Peter. So I'm going to ask you this. Is the main point of Jesus walking on the water about Peter walking on the water and seeing the waves instead of seeing Jesus? I'm like, there must be something else going on here. There must be another reason Jesus walking on the water was a serious story. And it's not that the Peter stuff is wrong, it's that it's incomplete. It's like something else must be going on here if one gospel leaves a story out and 2 others don't even mention Peter, including Peter's very own version, I mind you. So I'm looking at this and I'm reading through this and I'm like, here are 3 observations I made about the story as I read the 3 of them. The first observation I made is that the disciples were obeying Jesus when they got into trouble. That ever happened to you? You obeyed Jesus and things didn't go right? You did what Jesus told you to do, and somehow the outcome wasn't the same as you'd hoped? Because, see, they had just fed the 5,000. In fact, they had rowed all the way across the lake just to get away from the crowd. They got to the other side. All the people ran around the end of the lake and were there to meet them anyway. They had an all-day sermon, and then they gave them some food, and they did the feeding of the 5,000. As soon as the feeding of the 5,000 ends, Jesus tells his disciples, according to the story, Jesus puts them in the boat, and he sends them back across. If they are obeying Jesus when they're out there in the middle of the storm, they're obeying the will of God. And the first thing I noticed is like Jesus removes himself to go pray, to be by himself and go pray. And by the way, here's a little aside. If Jesus needed to get away by himself and pray, Jesus needed that, how much more do we? How much more do we need that, right? If even Jesus, the Lord God Almighty himself, said, okay, I'm going to tune everybody and everything out and go spend some time with the Father. You know, and most of us are like, yeah, I don't ever really do that. I mean, sure, in church we might pray and stuff, and now and then I say grace over my meal, and once in a while I might be led to, you know, say a prayer when I'm in trouble, but actually getting away to spend time with the Father, yeah, I don't do that. I think my life works pretty well without bothering to do that. And the problem is, if Jesus needed to do that, maybe we need it just as much. In fact, maybe we need that time more. So the first thing I notice is they're out there, Jesus has retreated to pray, and what's going on is Jesus is sending them away because they're about to get caught up in this huge fervor when, according to John, the crowd wants to take him by force and make him king. And so Jesus is like, rather have my disciples get caught up in this bunch of silliness, get in the boat, go out there. And so off they go. And they will run around the lake, and if you read the rest of John 6, you'll see they'll catch up with Jesus and still try to make him king and still try to get more bread, more food out of him and that deal. But the event is kind of interesting because he's fed the 5,000, he walks on the water, he arrives in Gennesaret, he does some healing, the crowd runs around the lake, and they meet him over there, and then more happens there. So here's my question with the disciples. Why are they in a storm that Jesus sent them into? That doesn't sound right, does it? It sounds like if I obey Jesus, if I'm obedient to Jesus and I do what Jesus tells me to do, things should work out good because he's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and he told me to do it, so the outcome should be predetermined as going to be good. Instead, I'm in this storm and I'm wind-tossed. My first observation is not every time you obey Jesus do things go well. But there's a reason it won't go well. And usually the reason it won't go well is because Jesus wants to show us something more about himself or teach us something about us. And usually it's a combination of both. And Jesus purposefully will sometimes put us in a difficult situation to teach us something about ourselves and what's more, something about him. So the second observation I make is that nobody's afraid until Jesus shows up. Did you notice that? We read all three stories, and they're out there in the wind. Now, here's what's interesting. I love this. Every movie you will ever watch about the life of Jesus, when this walk on the water thing happens, it's thunder and lightning and rain and waves and storm tossed. And the disciples think they're going to go down with the ship and they're going to drown and all that kind of thing. But actually, that's not in the Bible. What's in the Bible is it's a windstorm. It's not raining. It's not lightning. It's not thundering. It's a windstorm. And these guys are, at least half the boat, are professional sailors. They're in a windstorm, rowing and rowing against the wind. They're not afraid. They're not scared. The ship ain't going down. The problem is they're exhausted. They're worn out. They did what Jesus told them to do, and they're out there in the middle of the lake, and they're worn out. And I think I've got a bit of a map to show you about So they had crossed from where you see Gennesaret and Capernaum. They had crossed over to the region of Bethsaida on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee. And they had been over there, and somewhere in that wild wilderness south of Bethsaida, near the shore, along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, on the east side, that's where this takes place, in a remote region where there's no significant towns of any kind. That's why they can't go buy food. That's why Jesus has to supply them. And so they've been over there. That's 4 or 5 miles across the lake at that place. If you went from Capernaum straight across, or you went from Gennesaret straight across, it's about 4 miles. And so they're over on that side where there's nothing. They do the feeding. He puts them back in the boat, and he says, go back to Capernaum. And it's already late at night when he sends them out. They're tired. They're exhausted. They've had a long 2 days. They've had a difficult time. They're rowing, and now the wind kicks up, and the wind is blowing the opposite direction, so they're actually rowing into the wind, trying to make their boat work right? Trying to get things going. And it says that they're about 3 or 4 stadia out, where we get the term stadium. It's a Roman figure, so they're probably in the middle of the lake. They're close enough that Jesus on a mountaintop who's praying can look out on the lake and see them. He sees them straining at the oars. He sees them working. They had plenty of time to actually make it 3 or 4 miles across, a bunch of guys rowing. They should have been there by now. But instead, they're straining, they're rowing, and it is now turned into the darkest point of the night when they see Jesus. They've made no progress. I was out, I got a little 10-foot fishing boat, and sometimes I like to go out fishing, and sometimes I go out by myself and throw this motor in and go out there. And I fish out at Williams Lake and stuff, and it can get windy out there. And I've been out there one time, I was on my boat, and I got to the one way, I don't know if it's the one end of the lake. We'll just say one end, because it's kind of a long, narrow lake. And I was at one end, I had docked, and I was out there fishing and having a great time. The wind started to kick up a little bit, and then a little 10-foot boat, it doesn't take much of a wave when you're bouncing and rocking in that thing. And I said, I better get back. And no engine starting, right? I'm like, dang, look at how far it is. Now, I am smart enough to put oars in my boat, right? I'm not out there, help me, help me. You don't want to have other guys in boats show up and ask you why you're dumb, so you have oars. Right, so I do it out of oars, and so I get in a boat, and I'm rowing, man, and I'm rowing. Now, normally I can row pretty well, and it's just like when you're in a little 10-foot boat and the waves are hitting you, the bow of that boat's bouncing like this, and you cannot keep the thing straight, right? So like every second or third row, I'm looking, oh, I'm off again. Oh, dang, I'm off again. And you're rowing. How far have I come? And I'm looking at a tree, right? I'm marking myself by that tree, and I'm rowing, and I'm off again, I'm looking at that tree, and I'm looking at that tree, and I'm like, hey, whoa, right? The tree ain't moving. I should be past that tree by now. And it took forever to get back, and I was exhausted. And I was rocking, and it's hard to keep the boat going. I can imagine these guys in a big old boat 3 miles out in the Sea of Galilee. They're not scared, they're just worn out. They're exhausted, they're tired. They've been doing this, and you can't turn around because you can't put that boat sideways when the waves are hitting. Boo, you'll go over. You can't go back. The only thing you can do is just keep rowing, and staying in the same spot. And you just keep rowing because you hope that at some point the wind will die down and you could start making progress. And I'm looking at these guys and I'm thinking, holy smokes, they obeyed Jesus. And they're in the middle of a lake and they're rowing to the point of exhaustion and making no progress. And I wonder how many times that fits our lives. How many times in our life we feel like, I'm trying to do something here, Jesus, that you want me to do. I heard you give me a calling. I heard you tell me to do this. I heard you tell me to step out in faith, and I've done it. And I've been at it, and I've been at it, and I've been at it, and I keep going. And I'm just rowing, and I don't feel like I'm making any progress or I'm gaining any ground or I'm making any headway. And I'm kind of wondering, Jesus, where are you now? Because you didn't get in a boat with me. You sent me. And now I'm out there rowing, and that's where I'm at, and I'm not making any progress, and I'm exhausted, and I'm frustrated. And I don't know why I'm here. I don't know. And I can't quit. You can't quit. No, because that boat will turn sideways and you'll get swamped. So you just got to keep rowing and making no progress. And I'm watching these guys in the boat and thinking about that. And I'm thinking about times in our lives as people when it feels like that. You're trying to obey Jesus. You're trying to get out of debt. And you're rowing and you're rowing and you're rowing, trying to get out of debt. But you can't seem to make any progress no matter how hard you try. Sometimes it's just loneliness, and you're trying to make friends, and you're trying to put yourself out there, and you're trying to build some kind of community, and you're rowing and you're rowing and you're rowing because that's what Jesus wants you to do until you're tired and you're frustrated. Sometimes it's with the family or the marriage, right? Trying to get along with my kids, or trying to get along with my mom and dad, or trying to get along with my husband or my wife, and I'm rowing and I'm rowing. I'm trying to be obedient to you, Jesus, because I know you want this to be a healthy, successful relationship. And I'm out in the middle of this lake doing what you told me to do, and I'm rowing and I'm rowing and I'm rowing, and I'm not making any progress, and I'm tired, and the night has gotten dark around me. Sometimes it's our careers. Feeling like I chose a career you led me into, Lord, and I'm out here in the middle of the lake being obedient to you, but the winds have always been contrary. I can't go back. I can't turn around. I'm stuck rowing and rowing and rowing, but I'm making no progress. You're not afraid. You're just tired and worn out and exhausted and a little empty and wondering, what do I have to do next? And the only hope is maybe the wind will die down. And I'm looking at this, and it's at that point, Jesus shows up, and then they get scared. They get scared when Jesus shows up, right? And I'm looking at this, and I'm freaked out by the Mark passage, because I read through the Mark passage. Did you catch the little phrase in Mark 6:48? And he was about to pass them by. Did you catch that phrase when I read Mark? Or right? Take a quick peek at it. Mark chapter 6, verse 48. What? Jesus comes out walking on the water, and he hits the boat, and he was about to walk on by. Right? And I read that the first time, and I thought, I got to have that wrong. I'm going to look this up in several different translations, and I'm going to examine the Greek words, and I'm going to see what it really meant in the Greek. And so after a couple hours of study and really looking at multiple translations, here's what it really means. He was about to walk on by. And I'm like, where do I fit that in the story? Huh? What? Jesus was walking by. Hey, guys, look, I have a little trouble. Hey, I'll meet you on the other side. I'll be up here. Okay, catch you later. Right? Was that what was going on? It was just crazy. He was about to walk on by, and they're freaked out, right? Something's going on. And then they start like, oh, my, it's a ghost, because obviously he can't be walking on the water. This is supernatural. There's no way this could be done. And so they're all freaking out because they're seeing this supernatural Jesus that is so different, so big, so huge. I mean, Jesus healing a sick guy, Jesus, healing a lame guy, Jesus opening the eyes of blind. I can take that. But Jesus walking on the water, oh, that's otherworldly. That's a different universe. That's God-like. Why, yes, it is. And it's interesting because Jesus says in all these passages, Jesus gives this phrase, it's me, right? He says, it's me. It's an interesting phrase in the Greek because actually what he literally says in the Greek is, I am. I am. When he says, I am the bread of life, same words he uses. When he says, I am the light of the world, same exact words he uses, right? When I'm the bread that comes down from heaven, when I am the path, I'm the way, the truth, and the light. Every time he says, I am, that's what he says in these passages to the guys. He says, hey, I am. You know why that's an interesting phrase, I am? When Moses was at the burning bush, learning about God for the very first time, because the Hebrew people didn't know him and hadn't met him, and he's bowing at the burning bush. He has to take off his sandals and come down and kneel before the burning bush, and God's going to speak to him for the first time. And Moses says, I'm going to go to the Hebrew children. What should I tell them your name is? Nobody even knows your name. And he says, tell them, I am that I am. That's the name of God. I am is his name. Always was, always is, always will be. The ever consistent, constant one. The force of the universe that had no beginning and no end, that had no point of origin. I am. So when Jesus is walking on the water and he's about to pass them by, and they're scared because he's a ghost, he says, I am. What's being said here? For the first time ever, they're realizing this Jesus we're following, he's bigger than a prophet. He's bigger than a holy man. He's bigger than a miracle worker. This story isn't about Peter. This story is about Jesus being God. And he's revealing his godlike traits to them. He's showing them something about who he is. Up till that time, because he looks so ordinary, right? The Bible kind of indicates he wasn't handsome. Isaiah said there was nothing about him that we should be attracted to him. He wasn't a super handsome guy. He was just an ordinary guy. But when he's walking on water and he says, I am, then they're realizing this is something different. And if you noticed in the Matthew passage, when he climbs into the boat for the first time, they worship him. At the end of that passage, they worship him. They have never done that before. They're seeing something different about him. And I'm interested because I'm thinking about faith in the storms and how it works, right? And I'm thinking, well, if you have a little bit of faith, if you're in a kind of a big windstorm and you're making no progress, a little faith would say, if Jesus were here, he'd help me row. If Jesus were here, he'd help me. That's a little bit of faith. If you got medium faith, you might say, well, if Jesus were here, he'd calm the storm. And then we could row, right? If Jesus were here, he'd fix that. If you had big faith, you would say, well, if Jesus were here, not only would he calm the storm, he'd just shift the wind in the opposite direction and get us to the other side really fast. That would be big faith. What no one had faith is, if Jesus were here, he'd walk on the water and get in the boat with us. No one's thinking that. That's not in anybody's brain. That's not in anybody's thinking. He would come walking out on the water and get in the boat with us. See, we think of Jesus fixing our problems in expected ways. Sometimes we know how life works. We know how things are. And Jesus will do something that we kind of expect, and we'll give him a little latitude to do something maybe bigger than the normal, but not out of the box, not otherworldly. And when Jesus comes walking on the water, it's interesting because what he's saying is, look, I'm God. And you understand something, who you're worshiping is, and for them, they're being blown away. You and I, we've been raised on Jesus as the Son of God. But think about this, the Jesus who loves you, the Jesus who died on the cross for you, the Jesus you pray to, the Jesus who you bring your problems to, the Jesus who knows the secret things about your life and your innermost thoughts is God. Is God. How big is God? How powerful is God? What scares or intimidates God? Absolutely nothing. And so when we come to him sometimes, there's a little bit of a lack of reverence on our part, a lack of the understanding of how powerful and huge he really is. And the apostles are seeing this for the very first time, this otherworldliness. And there's an interesting verse that's in Job. I think I got it. Job chapter 9, verse 8 says this, and it's referring to the God Almighty. He alone spreads out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. Only God can do that. So when Jesus is walking on the water, he's revealing something so much bigger. They were ready for him to be a king like God Messiah. They were ready for him to be a son of David. They were ready for him to take over the government. They weren't prepared for him to be God. And so they're sitting there in his boat and they're having this thing. It's interesting because he's saying these, like, for a Hebrew mind, the sea is chaos. Dread, chaos, mayhem, all of those things, danger, risk, Satan, evil forces, spiritual forces have always been associated with the sea. So when you read the Old Testament and you hear about the sea and the wind and the waves will rise up against us, it really means all the forces of chaos and dread and rebellion and Satan's minions, all of that is the sea. When Jesus treads and walks upon the sea, it shows his ultimate power over everything. And I look at this, and the last observation I was making as I was looking at this is like, the ultimate rescue is not actually for them to get out of the boat and really walk on the water. The ultimate rescue, really what's being happening here, is to enter into God's realm. To enter into God's realm. See, kind of back to Peter a little bit. I do think there's something in the story of Peter stepping out in tremendous faith, right? There is something about him. When I was young, I thought, Peter asks to jump out of the boat and go walk in Jesus because the ship was going down and he was trying to save himself. That's how I heard the story when I was a little kid. Like, Peter was saying, heck with you guys, you can drown, I'm going to go be with Jesus, right? That's kind of how I heard the story when I was young. But Peter isn't jumping ship to save his life. He's actually not scared till they see Jesus. When he sees Jesus, what he's really asking, and he could see Jesus after, he's like, oh, you're otherworldly. I'm in a boat, and the boat makes sense to me. I know the mathematics of this boat. I know its dimensions. I know the length and I know the beam. I know how it's measured and how it's built so that it can float. I understand water displacement. I understand what this boat will do in waves. I understand what this boat will do in wind. See, this is human experience and human reason. All of our science and our knowledge brought to bear is the boat. It's security. It's what Peter knows. He spent his whole life dealing with the boat. To step out of the boat onto the water, oh, that's otherworldly. That's something else entirely different. That's getting out of human reason and human science and human knowledge and human experience. And everything he knows about life and what is true is about to change when he steps out of the boat to go walk on the water. But he can't just jump. He has to wait till Jesus asks him, right? And I've known people like, they just jump ship and they say, well, I quit my job and I'm just jumping ship and I'm quitting my job. I'm going to go do something else. And I'm stepping out in faith. I'm like, dude, that's not faith. That's just foolishness. Faith is when Jesus tells you to do something and you do it. Faith is not, I'm going to do something stupid and he has to catch me, right? No, that's not faith at all. Faith isn't doing something foolish and basically demanding he catch you. Faith is when you hear him call you and you hear his voice tell you to do something and it's hard to do, but you do it anyway. Peter doesn't just jump out of the boat. He does say, call me. And so he says, all right, come. And he steps out of everything he knows to be true. He steps out of everything he knows to be familiar. He steps out of his entire life experience. He steps out of human reason and human knowledge and human mathematics and water displacement and measurements of wood and all the buoyancy of the boat. He steps out of everything in order to go be with Jesus. And I'm looking at this, and it's like, okay, so then, I understand. Then he sinks. He falls because the waves get big. And, I was talking to somebody about this, and we're like, man, how agile was Jesus that he could walk on the waves that were huge, right? Somebody say, yeah, he must have been like CrossFit or something. Well, he was a carpenter without power tools, so he had to be a strong guy. But he's not walking on a flat surface. He's walking on these crazy waves, and Peter comes out, and the waves are rocking and rolling, and he's looking around. Suddenly, he's feeling that, and it is true. He doesn't see, but when he starts sinking, all he has to cry out is, Lord, save me. Lord, save me. That's all it takes. Boom, Jesus grabs him. I love Romans 10:13. It says, all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And sometimes I love that verse because it's so reassuring. No matter how bad it gets, how many times you screw up, how often the failure is, how many times you pray the same prayer, all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. All who cry out, Lord, save me, will be saved. And I love and I'm comforted in that whole thing. And sometimes that verse annoys me to no end because a bunch of people are going to cry out, Lord, save me, who don't deserve it. Right? That's why it's grace. Right? No, they don't deserve it. I don't deserve it. You don't deserve it. None of us deserve salvation. It's all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And so when you cry out, Lord, save me, bam, I got you. I got you. Pulls them up out of the water. But it's interesting, they don't then, okay, let's walk the rest of the way to Capernaum. Peter, just you and me, bud. We'll leave those guys behind. Away we go. They walk back to the boat, and they get into the boat together. And it's interesting that John 6:21 says they willingly receive him into their boat. Like they said, yeah, okay, you come and get in the boat with us. And I think it's interesting because some people say, oh, then he rebukes Peter. But I didn't read that word rebuke in the passage. All he says to Peter is, oh, Peter, you half-faith guy. That's what he literally says, little faith. Oh, you have little faith. You have half faith. And you're just like, man, the guy got out of the boat and walked on water. I don't think anybody else in human history could say that. And Jesus is looking at him like, but you only had a little faith. Why? You had enough faith to get started, but not enough to finish. You had enough faith to trust me, but not enough to hold on to my hand all the way to the end. You had enough faith to get going, but not enough faith to complete it. And so he's looking at it like, you were already walking on the water. Why would you freak out now, right? The freaky part was that first step out of the boat. But once you'd taken a couple steps, you should have been fine. But then your faith failed you then. After you were walking on the water, your faith failed you. And it's because you got scared of what was going on around you. And maybe the overarching, unbelievable, otherworldly bizarreness that you were walking on water. And you said, how can this possibly be? And so you began to sink and Jesus saves you. And then Jesus gets back into the boat with them. And I'm looking at this whole story and thinking about it, and I said, and then Mark concludes with this weird phrase, because they had not understood about the fish and the loaves. I was like, what? What does that got to do with being out here in the middle of the lake in the windstorm, right? Because the fish and the loaves was still a miracle that Jesus was meeting people's needs. And as long as this holy man was healing people and he was doing something for people and people were getting better and people's hunger was being matched and their physical ailment was being alleviated and he was casting demons out of people, as long as their physical needs and their illnesses were being cared for, we kind of understood that. It wasn't weird. And when he did the feeding, we saw him do that. We knew it was a miracle, but what did they not understood? They had not understood that this guy I'm hanging out with is God. They had not understood that. And so he does this thing to send you guys out in the boat because I just did this miracle that you should have realized by then that that's beyond just being a prophet. And it's going to send you out in the boat, and in the storm, I'm going to show you something even more about me. And he went out there walking, and now they understood, oh, we're following God. And when he steps back into the boat with them, for the first time, they worship him. Earlier, when he had calmed the storm, they had said, what kind of guy is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? but they hadn't worshiped him. Now for the first time they're realizing, hey man, we're having lunch with God. We're hanging out with God. And they're seeing that. That's what's going on. They worship him. And I'm thinking about this story, and I'm thinking about this. They're obedient to Jesus when they get rowing out. And I think that, in the end, it's better to be out of the boat with Jesus than in the boat without Jesus. Doesn't that make sense? Better to be out of the boat but be with Jesus than to stay inside the boat and not have Jesus. And what does that mean for your life? I mean, think about all of your experiences, everything you know to be true. All of your knowledge and your education and your training and all of your experience, everything that you know of how reality works, everything you know about science and everything you know about history and everything you know about, I don't know, anything, any topic under the sun, everything you know to be true, everything that you realize how life works and how humanity is being in the boat. And it's better to be out of that boat and be with Jesus than to be in the boat without him. And Peter steps out of the boat. He gets to walk on the water, and he does think, and Jesus grabs him. And I was thinking about that, thinking, and the best place of all is to be in the grip of Jesus. The best place of all is to be in Jesus' hands, where he lifts Peter back up. They're walking on the water, and they keep walking on the water from that point on. For us, in our era, in our time, in our modern era, I think there's some times in our lives that that's really the question. Most of us, I've realized over time, listening to our prayers and praying for people watching us, we're always crying for Jesus to sort of come into our world, right? Jesus, come into my life. Jesus, come into my problem. Jesus, come into my situation. Jesus, come into what's going on in my life right now and save me, help me, rescue me, change things, teach me, train me, whatever. Jesus, come into my world and help me. And when I read this story, it's the most dominant story where Jesus is clearly saying, no, get out of your world and come into mine. And I'm like, wow, that's a whole nother spin on things, isn't it? Let go of my world and my understanding and my knowledge and let go of it and get out of my world and get into his. And Jesus is saying, I'm operating on this whole other level, this whole other universe, this whole other framework of thinking, this whole other understanding of human history and what is going on, this whole other grasp of what is good and true, what is evil and what is not. I'm operating on this whole other level. And your life will work way better and he will come into our world, but maybe the prayer should be, Lord, come into my life. Maybe the prayer should be, Lord, how do I come into your world and walk with you where you are and the things that you're doing and be with you where you call me to be? Because it's not my life anymore. It's your life that's important. It's not me inviting you into my super important world. I mean, let's be honest. None of us here got that kind of important life. It's maybe the most important thing is for us to get out of our world and into his. And him saying, let me show you things that you would never otherwise see, take you places you would otherwise never go, introduce you to people you would otherwise never meet, let you perceive and understand and grasp realities that right now staying in your own boat is too limiting. Yeah. And that's enough. Why don't you stand with me and we'll close in prayer. Lord, I'm thinking as I finish those last words that every single one of us in the room right now, when we think about our own boat, we all have our own unique, individualized boat. And we have floated through our lives and sailed in the course of our lives and gone through our lives knowing and understanding how this boat works. And it has limited us in ways, but it's also taken us places. It's our knowledge, it's our education, it's our experience, it's our families, where we've been, what we've done. Everything we know to be true, all the practices of life that we have ever had, that's our boat, and every single one of us in this room has a different boat. And Lord, it's hard for us to hear that when you come by, you're going to pass on by. But maybe what you're saying instead is, for us to truly follow you, we need to hear your voice to get out of all of that. Climb out of that boat, even if it's for a moment, to meet you on your terms and come into your world as you are. As you are the God of the universe, the King of kings and the Lord of all lords, the master of all human history, the one who raises up civilizations and brings them down, the one who is guiding all of human history to a point where it will end in your glory and your reign. And so, Lord, I'm going to ask this for all of us. We don't want to jump out of the boat and be stupid. We need to hear your voice. We need to hear you call us. And for those of us, Lord, that you want to call to something higher, something bigger, something more, will you make it so that we can hear your voice clearly, and we're not guessing, and we're not analyzing, and we're not putting pros and cons lists together, but we're hearing your voice clearly. May we let go of everything that we're thinking we have to hold on to because it's so important, and just grasp your hand and say, Jesus, take me where you want me to be. Let me see the world and my experiences through your eyes on your terms, and not always make you come on my terms. May your power and your glory and your spirit reign in us, Lord Jesus. May we see you as Lord, and not just as a convenient addition in our life, and not just something sentimental, but you are God of the universe. And may we just bow to you as our master, and we say, Lord, command me. Command me, and I will obey. Show me, and I will follow. Lead me, and I will go. And this is our prayer, and we ask it in your name because you are the Most High God. And in your name, and matching with your character and all that you are, and all that you hold dear and true, everything that you value, we ask you, Lord, take our lives and do with them what you will. This we pray. Amen. It'll be interesting to see what God does with each of us.